Eleanor closed the funeral program and placed it in the wooden box beside her bed. Dorothy's program joined 17 others she'd collected over the past 5 years. Her best friend since childhood, gone at 81 after a brief battle with pneumonia. The house felt impossibly quiet. No more Tuesday morning phone calls discussing the weather or sharing recipes. No more weekly bridge games where they'd solved the world's problems between hands. No more late-night conversations about their children, grandchildren, and the old days when life seemed simpler. Eleanor walked through her empty house, past photos of friends who existed now only in memory. There was Martha from book club who'd passed 3 years ago. Robert and Helen, the couple from next door who died within 6 months of each other. Her church friends, her childhood neighbors, her college roommates, all gone. At 83, Eleanor had become an expert at attending funerals and writing sympathy cards. She'd perfected the art of standing alone at gravesites, watching dirt fall on coffins of people who'd shared decades of her life. The doorbell rang, interrupting her somber thoughts. Through the window, she saw Mrs. Chen, her new neighbor, holding a covered dish. "I brought you some soup," Mrs. Chen said when Eleanor opened the door. "I saw you come home from the service today. I'm sorry for your loss." Eleanor accepted the warm container gratefully. "Thank you. That's very kind. Were you close? You and the lady who passed?" "Dorothy was my best friend for 70 years, Eleanor said, surprised by how the words caught in her throat. "We met in 1st grade. Mrs. Chen's face softened with understanding. "That's a long friendship. You must feel very alone right now." Alone. The word hung in the air between them like a physical thing. Eleanor nodded, not trusting herself to speak. "I lost my husband 2 years ago," Mrs. Chun continued. "All our friends back in Taiwan, they're getting older too. Some days I feel like I'm the only one left." Something in Mrs. Chen's voice resonated with Eleanor's own pain. Here was someone who understood the particular loneliness of outliving the people who'd shaped your life. "Would you like to come in for tea?" Eleanor asked impulsively. As they sat in Eleanor's living room, sharing stories about loss and loneliness, Eleanor felt a small spark of something she hadn't experienced in months. Connection. Not the deep, decades-long connection she'd shared with Dorothy, but something real nonetheless. But even as she appreciated Mrs. Chen's kindness, Eleanor couldn't shake the weight of her solitude. Everyone was gone. Everyone who'd truly known her, who'd shared her history, who'd understood her without explanation. Everyone except... The thought stopped her mid-sentence. Everyone except Jesus. Chapter 2. The Empty Pew. Sunday morning arrived gray and drizzling, matching Eleanor's mood perfectly. She sat in the same pew she'd occupied for 43 years, but now she sat alone. The space beside her, where Dorothy had sat for the past 2 decades, felt like a gaping wound. Pastor Williams was young, probably in his 30s, and meant well, but his sermons about abundant life and God's blessings felt hollow when delivered to a congregation where Eleanor knew she was the oldest member by at least 15 years. During the opening hymn, Eleanor's voice caught on the familiar words. "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound, that saved a wretch like me." She'd sung these words thousands of times with Dorothy harmonizing beside her. Now her single voice felt lost in the mostly empty sanctuary. After service, Pastor Williams approached her in the parking lot. "Mrs. Patterson, how are you holding up?" "I'm managing," Eleanor replied automatically, the response she'd perfected over the past few years. "I know losing Dorothy has been hard. You two were inseparable." Eleanor nodded. Pastor Williams was trying to be kind, but he'd only been at the church for 3 years. He hadn't watched her friendship with Dorothy span decades, hadn't seen them support each other through their husbands' deaths, their children's divorces, their own health scares. "If you ever need anything, please don't hesitate to call," Pastor Williams continued. "We're family here." Family. Eleanor almost laughed at the irony. Her actual family lived 3 states away and called once a month out of duty. The church family she'd built over 4 decades had gradually moved away or passed away, leaving her with well-meaning strangers who offered generic comfort. Driving home, Eleanor passed the cemetery where Dorothy was buried. On impulse, She pulled into the parking lot and walked to the fresh grave. The flowers from yesterday's service were already wilting in the morning drizzle. "I don't know how to do this without you." Eleanor whispered to the headstone. "Everyone's gone. I feel like I'm just waiting my turn." The words hung in the damp air, unanswered. That evening, Eleanor sat in her favorite chair, the one that faced the window overlooking her garden. She'd been avoiding her evening prayers lately. What was the point of talking to God when he seemed to be systematically removing everyone she cared about from her life? But tonight, something made her fold her hands anyway. "Lord," she began hesitantly, "I know you're there. I've believed in you my whole life, even when things were hard. But right now I feel so alone. Everyone I love is with you now, and I'm still here. I don't understand why." She paused, listening to the silence. "Dorothy always said you never leave us or forsake us. But Lord, it's hard to feel your presence when everyone who helped me see you is gone." As she spoke, something shifted in her heart. Not an answer exactly, but a sense that her words weren't falling into empty space. For the first time in months, Eleanor felt like someone was listening. Chapter 3. The Garden Revelation. 2 weeks later, Eleanor stood in her backyard, staring at her neglected vegetable garden. She and Dorothy had planned it together last spring, before Dorothy's health declined. Now weeds threatened to overtake the tomatoes and beans they'd planted with such hope. Eleanor grabbed her gardening gloves and knelt among the overgrown plants. As she worked, memories flooded back. Dorothy's laughter as they'd struggled to install the trellis, their debates over which varieties of tomatoes to plant, their shared excitement over the first tiny green shoots. "I don't know why I'm bothering," Eleanor muttered, pulling weeds with more force than necessary. "Who am I going to share these vegetables with?" A voice behind her made her jump. "Those tomatoes look like they might be salvageable." Eleanor turned to see Mrs. Chun approaching with a watering can. "I noticed you out here and thought you might need some help." "Oh, you don't need to." "I want to," Mrs. Chun interrupted gently. "My husband and I had a garden. Since he died, I haven't had anyone to share the work with." They worked together in comfortable silence for a while, Mrs. Chen's presence somehow making the task feel less overwhelming. As they cleared weeds and staked falling tomato plants, Eleanor found herself talking about Dorothy. "She always said gardening was like faith," Eleanor said, tying a heavy tomato branch to its stake. "You plant seeds not knowing if they'll grow, but you water them anyway, trusting something good will come." Mrs. Chun nodded thoughtfully. "In my culture, we say that those who plant trees knowing they may never sit in their shade are truly wise." Something about the conversation stirred a memory in Eleanor. Dorothy had often quoted scripture while they gardened, something about planting and harvesting. What was it? That evening, Eleanor dusted off her Bible for the first time in weeks. She flipped through the pages, looking for the passage Dorothy used to reference. Finally, she found it in Ecclesiastes. "To everything there is a season, and a time to every purpose under heaven. A time to plant and a time to pluck up that which is planted." Eleanor read the verse several times, then continued reading. "A time to be born and a time to die, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance." The words felt like Dorothy speaking directly to her. There was a season for mourning, and Eleanor was certainly in that season. But the passage suggested that mourning wasn't meant to be permanent. There would be other seasons too. As she closed the Bible, Eleanor noticed a piece of paper tucked between the pages. Dorothy's handwriting, in the shaky script of her final months. "Ellie, remember that Jesus plants us where we're needed, even when we can't see why. Keep growing, dear friend. The harvest isn't over yet." Eleanor pressed the note to her chest, tears flowing freely for the first time since Dorothy's funeral. But these tears felt different. Not just grief, but something deeper. Recognition, maybe, or hope. Dorothy was gone, but her wisdom remained. And maybe Eleanor thought that was one way Jesus had never left her, through the voices of friends who continued to speak truth even after death. The thought was both comforting and challenging. If Dorothy was right, if Eleanor was planted where she was needed, then what was she supposed to be growing? Chapter 4. The Young Visitor. 3 days after finding Dorothy's note, Eleanor heard a knock at her front door. Through the window, she saw a young woman holding a sleeping baby, looking uncertain and tired. "I'm sorry to bother you," the woman said when Eleanor opened the door. "I'm Lisa. I just moved into the apartment complex down the street. Mrs. Chun said you might have some advice about the neighborhood." Eleanor studied the young mother. Lisa couldn't be more than 25, with dark circles under her eyes and the slightly overwhelmed look Eleanor remembered from her own early mothering years. "Of course. Come in." Lisa settled carefully on Eleanor's sofa, adjusting the baby in her arms. "I'm a single mom," she explained. "Emma's dad isn't in the picture, and I don't have family nearby. Mrs. Chun mentioned you'd lived here a long time and might know about good pediatricians, grocery stores, that sort of thing." As Eleanor provided local recommendations, she found herself studying Lisa's face. The young woman was trying hard to appear capable, but Eleanor recognized the signs of someone barely keeping it together. "How old is Emma?" Eleanor asked. 3 months. She's been colicky, which makes everything harder." Lisa's voice cracked slightly. "I moved here for a job, but I don't know anyone. Some days I feel so alone, especially at night when Emma won't stop crying." The word alone hit Eleanor like a physical blow. Here was someone else drowning in loneliness, but for completely different reasons. Lisa was isolated by circumstance and new motherhood. Eleanor was isolated by loss and time. "Would you like some coffee?" Eleanor offered. "Emma seems content at the moment." Over the next hour, Lisa shared her story. A recent college graduate, she'd gotten pregnant during her senior year. The baby's father had disappeared when he learned about the pregnancy. Lisa's parents lived across the country and couldn't afford to visit. She'd taken a job in their town because it offered good benefits and affordable housing, but she knew no one. "I keep thinking I'm doing everything wrong," Lisa confided. "When Emma cries at night, I don't know if she's hungry or tired or sick. My mom always said raising babies was instinctive, but I feel like I'm failing at something that should be natural." Eleanor felt something stirring in her chest, a familiar sensation she hadn't experienced in years. The desire to nurture, to guide, to share hard-won wisdom. "Lisa," she said carefully, "what if I told you that every new mother feels exactly the way you're feeling? That the instinct your mother mentioned develops through practice, not magic?" Lisa looked up hopefully. "Really? Really? I raised 3 children, and I felt completely lost with my first. Your grandmother probably felt the same way, and her grandmother before that." For the next half hour, Eleanor found herself sharing stories from her early mothering days. The mistakes, the fears, the small victories that built confidence over time. Lisa listened intently, occasionally laughing at Eleanor's more embarrassing parenting confessions. When Emma woke and began fussing, Eleanor watched Lisa's confidence crumble instantly. "I don't know what she wants," Lisa said, near tears. "May I?" Eleanor asked, extending her arms. Lisa handed over the baby, and Eleanor began the gentle rocking motion she remembered from decades past. Emma's cries gradually subsided. "How did you do that?" Lisa asked in amazement. "Experience," Eleanor said simply, "and the knowledge that babies cry for lots of reasons, most of which aren't emergencies." As Lisa prepared to leave, she hesitated at the door. "Mrs. Patterson, would it be okay if I came back sometime? Maybe when I'm feeling overwhelmed?" Eleanor looked at this young woman who was so different from her deceased friends yet struggling with the same fundamental human need for connection and guidance. "You're welcome any time," Eleanor said, meaning it completely. After Lisa left, Eleanor sat in her quiet house, but the silence felt different. Not empty, expectant. Dorothy's note echoed in her mind. "Jesus plants us where we're needed." Maybe Eleanor's purpose in this season wasn't to mourn what was lost, but to offer what remained. Chapter 5. The pattern emerges. Over the next month, Lisa's visits became regular occurrences. She'd arrive stressed and leave calmer, having received both practical advice and emotional support. Eleanor found herself looking forward to these encounters in a way that surprised her. But Lisa wasn't the only one who began seeking Eleanor's wisdom. Mrs. Chun started stopping by for evening tea, sharing her own struggles with loneliness and cultural displacement. Through Mrs. Chun, Eleanor met other neighbors, retired teachers, widowed men, immigrant families trying to navigate American customs. Pastor Williams called one afternoon with an unusual request. "Mrs. Patterson, I have a young couple in premarital counseling who are struggling with some practical aspects of marriage. The husband grew up in foster care and has no family models for how marriage actually works day to day. Would you be willing to meet with them?" Eleanor almost said no. What did she know about modern marriage? Her own had ended with her husband's death 15 years ago, but something made her agree. When Jake and Monica arrived that evening, Eleanor recognized the same uncertain hope she'd seen in Lisa's face. They were young, in love, and completely unprepared for the reality of building a life together. "We keep fighting about stupid things," Monica explained, "like who does dishes or how to spend money. We love each other, but we don't know how to live together." Eleanor made tea and found herself sharing stories about her own marriage, the early years of figuring out roles and responsibilities, the arguments that seemed earth-shattering at the time but proved to be normal growing pains. "The secret," Eleanor told them, "isn't avoiding disagreements. It's learning to disagree with respect and work toward solutions together." Over the following weeks, Jake and Monica returned several times, each visit revealing new challenges they were facing. Eleanor realized she was becoming something she'd never expected to be, a mentor to people young enough to be her grandchildren. One evening, as she prepared for another visit from Lisa, Eleanor found herself praying differently than she had in months. "Lord," she said, "I'm starting to understand something. All these years I thought my friends were my purpose, but maybe they were preparing me for this purpose. All the wisdom I gained through decades of friendship, all the experience from raising children and maintaining a marriage, maybe none of it was just for me." The realization was both humbling and energizing. Eleanor looked around her house, seeing it with new eyes. The photos of deceased friends weren't just monuments to loss. They were reminders of lessons learned, wisdom gained, experiences that had shaped her into someone who could guide others. Dorothy's voice seemed to echo in her memory. "Keep growing, dear friend. The harvest isn't over yet." Eleanor was beginning to understand what Dorothy had meant. The harvest wasn't about what Eleanor could gather for herself. It was about what she could share with others who were just beginning their own seasons of planting. But even as she embraced this new purpose, Eleanor couldn't shake a nagging question. Was she strong enough to pour into others when she still felt so empty herself? The answer would come sooner than she expected. Chapter 6. The Test. Everything changed on a Thursday in late September. Eleanor woke feeling dizzy and weak, barely making it to the kitchen before collapsing. Mrs. Chun found her hours later and called an ambulance. At the hospital, doctors diagnosed dehydration and exhaustion but wanted to keep Eleanor overnight for observation. As she lay in the sterile hospital room, the old fears crept back in. What if this was the beginning of her own decline? What if she ended up like Dorothy, weakening gradually until the thoughts spiraled into familiar territory, the loneliness, the sense that everyone important had already left her behind. That evening, Lisa appeared in the doorway, holding Emma and looking concerned. "Mrs. Chun called me," Lisa explained. "I hope it's okay that I came." Behind Lisa came Jake and Monica, carrying flowers from Eleanor's own garden. Mrs. Chun arrived with homemade soup. Pastor Williams stopped by with several church members Eleanor barely knew but who'd heard about her kindness to young families. As Eleanor's small hospital room filled with people, she felt something profound shifting in her understanding. "We were so worried," Lisa said, settling into the chair beside Eleanor's bed. "You've become so important to all of us." "Important?" Eleanor asked, genuinely surprised. "Mrs. Patterson," Jake said earnestly, "you probably don't realize this, but you've changed our lives. Monica and I were ready to break up before we started talking with you. You taught us that marriage is a skill you learn, not just a feeling you have." Monica nodded. "You showed us that our problems were normal, that we could work through them. We wouldn't have made it without your guidance." Mrs. Chun spoke up from the corner. You helped me understand that grief doesn't have to mean isolation. You showed me how to build new connections while honoring old ones. Eleanor looked around the room at these faces, some familiar, some still relatively new, and felt something she hadn't experienced since Dorothy's funeral. She felt needed. Not in the desperate way she'd needed her old friends, but in a generative way. These people needed what she had to offer, and she needed the purpose their needs provided. I thought I was alone, Eleanor whispered. When all my friends died, I thought Jesus had forgotten about me too. Lisa leaned forward. Mrs. Patterson, don't you see? Jesus didn't forget you. He just changed how he was working through you. Instead of receiving comfort from friends, you became the comfort for people like us. The simple truth of Lisa's words hit Eleanor like lightning. She'd been so focused on who was missing from her life that she'd missed who was being added to it. Jesus hadn't abandoned her. He'd repositioned her. All those years of friendship, Eleanor said slowly, working through the realization. All that experience of loving people and being loved, it wasn't just for my benefit. It was preparation. Pastor Williams smiled. Mrs. Patterson, you've become one of our most effective ministers. You just don't realize it because you're not doing it from a pulpit. That night, after her visitors left, Eleanor lay in the hospital bed thinking about Dorothy's final note. Jesus plants us where we're needed. She'd interpreted that as being planted in a specific place, but maybe it was deeper than geography. Maybe Jesus planted experiences, relationships, and wisdom in people's hearts, then positioned them where that planting could bear fruit in others' lives. For the first time since Dorothy's death, Eleanor felt truly grateful to be alive. Chapter 7: The New Understanding. 6 months later, Eleanor's house had become an unofficial community center. Tuesday evenings were for young mothers, Lisa and 3 others who'd found their way to Eleanor's living room. Thursday afternoons brought marriage mentoring sessions. Saturday mornings meant coffee with Mrs. Chun and whoever else needed a listening ear. Eleanor's photo collection had grown too. Alongside pictures of her deceased friends were new photos. Lisa's family, Jake and Monica's wedding, Mrs. Chen's grandchildren visiting from Taiwan, the various young people who'd found their way to Eleanor's door seeking wisdom and finding family. On a particularly meaningful Sunday, Pastor Williams asked Eleanor to share her testimony with the congregation. Standing at the pulpit where she'd sat as a listener for over 4 decades, Eleanor looked out at faces that had become dear to her. 2 years ago, I thought my life was over, she began. Everyone I loved had died, and I felt forgotten by God and man. I spent months asking Jesus why he'd left me here alone when everyone else got to go home to him. She paused, looking at Lisa in the 3rd row, holding Emma, who was now a chubby, happy toddler. But I was asking the wrong question. Instead of asking why Jesus left me here, I should have been asking what he left me here to do. Eleanor shared her journey from isolation to purpose, from feeling useless to discovering that her experiences had prepared her for a unique ministry. I learned that friendship doesn't end with death, she continued. The love, wisdom, and strength I gained from decades of relationships didn't disappear when my friends died. Those gifts became tools Jesus could use to bless others. She looked at Jake and Monica, now married a year and glowing with the confidence of a couple who'd learned to work through challenges together. Dorothy used to say that Jesus plants us where we're needed. I thought that meant he'd forgotten about me when I felt so alone. But Jesus never left me. He was just transitioning me from one kind of service to another. After the service, Eleanor was surrounded by people sharing their own stories of loneliness transformed into purpose. But the most meaningful moment came when Mrs. Chun approached her with a young woman Eleanor hadn't met. This is my niece, Amy, Mrs. Chun explained. She just moved here from Taiwan. She speaks very little English and knows no one. She needs a grandmother figure, someone patient who can help her navigate this new culture. Eleanor looked at Amy's uncertain smile and saw herself reflected. Someone displaced, someone needing connection, someone who could bloom with the right encouragement. Welcome, Eleanor said in the few words of Mandarin Mrs. Chun had taught her. Amy's face lit up with surprise and gratitude. Later that evening, Eleanor sat in her favorite chair, looking out at her garden where tomatoes grew heavy on their vines. She thought about Dorothy's note, now framed on her mantel. Keep growing, dear friend. The harvest isn't over yet. The harvest, Eleanor now understood, wasn't about what she could gather for herself. It was about what grew from the seeds of love, wisdom, and experience that Jesus had planted in her heart through decades of relationships. Her friends hadn't left her empty when they died. They'd left her full of everything she needed to nurture the next generation of relationships, to be the answer to someone else's prayer for connection and guidance. Eleanor folded her hands in prayer, not with the desperate loneliness she'd felt 2 years ago, but with deep gratitude. Thank you, Jesus, she whispered, for never leaving me, even when I couldn't see you. Thank you for planting me exactly where I needed to be, exactly when these precious people needed someone to show them they weren't alone. Outside her window, the garden grew in the darkness, sustained by roots she couldn't see but trusted were there. Just like her faith, just like God's faithfulness, just like the love that connected her to both the friends who'd gone before and the family he'd given her to nurture now. Jesus had never left her. He'd simply been preparing her for the most important season of her life, the season of becoming the blessing she'd once needed to receive. What season of life are you in right now? Planting, growing, or harvesting? How might your past experiences be preparing you to bless others who are just beginning their journey?